Fields Branch Road, just outside of Grayson, Kentucky, not all that much different than other roads of its kind in the hills of Kentucky. Rich farmland surrounded by the thick Kentucky hills where wildlife roams and vegetation can become so heavy that it smothers the world around you, almost as if there is something here that wants to keep the outside world away and protect the people that inhabit the land. Nowadays we read and research about the days of old, and we look at the records that we find, and every now and then we happen upon something that is most definitely out of the ordinary. I think we romanticize the past to an extent. Perhaps we look at it through a lens that nothing bad ever happened, and if it did, it was surely a tragedy that couldn't be helped. As we drove down the road, pavement turning into gravel, and gravel turning into dirt, to find a cemetery that I wouldn't even attempt to travel without the use of a four-wheel drive, we peel back the curtain of a story that is as crazy as it is unbelievable. We see a family cemetery, very few graves. The grave marker of U.S. veteran James Miller is amongst those that dot the small plot of land. Most would say that this is an unassuming place, probably nobody here of historical significance, and even now you may be thinking, we're at the grave of a war hero. I'm not saying that we're not, but this story of being a war hero will be served with a man who possibly had two families and a trip and escape from the insane asylum, and an unbelievably tragic death. The beginning of our story takes us to North Carolina. James Miller was born in North Carolina in 1829 at a time when our country was beginning to have growing pains. During those formidable years of our republic, varying ideals were starting to take shape and cause rifts. Eventually, this would lead to a war between the North and the South. But that was far from young James Miller's mind at the time. He was born in North Carolina, as mentioned, and when he was a boy, lived in Bertie County, which was not far from the coast. As was common in those days, a migration westward began occurring when people chased new opportunities and a new life. Kentucky was an attractive land for such migrations. Kentucky was still in its infancy when James Miller was born, not yet 40 years old. Excellent farming conditions beckoned settlers from other lands, and James Miller would eventually make his way from his native North Carolina to the Bluegrass State. He would settle in Carter County, where this cemetery is located. He would marry his wife Delilah in 1866, and it was Delilah that would have the misfortune of dealing with James and his ways. You see, James most definitely had a checkered past and a seemingly wild lifestyle. However, such documentation of this behavior didn't appear before he volunteered to join the Union Army. Actually, it seems to be where the problems began. Kentucky was one of the few neutral states in the war. Most states had a clear allegiance, and much like local Kentucky politics today, Kentucky tried to straddle the fence, not wanting to make either side mad. James Miller enlisted in the 39th Kentucky Infantry Regiment, fighting for the Union Army. Organized in Peach Orchard in Lawrence County, Kentucky, the infantry mustered a 3-year enlistment on November 18, 1862, under the command of Colonel John Dills. The regiment would see action, although in mostly isolated skirmishes in various parts of eastern Kentucky, but would be involved in operations against noted Confederate John Hunt Morgan. The regiment lost a total of 234 men during its service, with 3 officers and 24 men killed in battle, but 194 were lost due to disease. James Miller was said to be in charge of tending to the horses of the regiment. Unfortunately, it was this assignment that led to the rest of his tragic life. It would be the job of James Miller to look after the horses, make sure they were ready, and yes, shoe them. The process of putting horseshoes on horses can be a tedious and dangerous job. If a particular horse is not agreeable, they can kick and cause some serious damage. It is said that James Miller was either kicked in the head, or some records show that he was kicked in the back. It is not clear if this injury caused a dismissal from the service, but what is clear is that this would have a lasting negative impact on him, which would ultimately be his demise. By the evidence that I have found, I have reason to believe that he did finish his 3-year commitment to the Union Army. The regiment mustered out of service on September 15, 1865. He would marry his wife Delilah Gillum on December 30th, 1865 in Carter County, Kentucky. The scourge of war and the kick from the horse would start to play a major role in his life. Today we know the dangers of head injuries, and we know that the brains of athletes have been examined that shows the extent of the damage. Back then, of course, no such technology. Miller's claims would start taking its startling shape. And what I mean by claims, at one point he claimed to be a pirate and would go on long expeditions looking for gold. A family story states that while he was out searching for gold, he was actually leaving his family behind to go help his other family plant their crops. It appears that James Miller was leading a double life. His behavior had become so erratic and dangerous that he was taken to Dr. L.D. Sparks, which would become his attending physician. After James had suffered through a few bouts of mental and physical illness, Dr. Sparks would pronounce him insane. Miller, living in Elliott County, Kentucky at the time, would go into custody of the Elliott County officials, who immediately got him before a judge. The court would officially slap the word insane on his record, and in those days, that's all it took. There was no rehab or mental health rehabilitation. You were taken to an insane asylum where you could be subject to brutal and inhumane practices. So officials shackled James Miller and took him to Lexington, Kentucky, to the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum. Most of the patients taken into this particular facility were considered incurable cases because nonviolent cases were sent to home care. The state considered these patients worst of the worst, and now James Miller was on his way there to spend the rest of his life. James Miller had been declared insane by the state of Kentucky, but that doesn't mean that he was incapacitated to the extent of the worst patients there. As a matter of fact, he had his wits about him, and I'm sure could have been cured using modern medicine. He knew that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in the insane asylum, and with no hope of ever gaining a release, he took matters into his own hands. He devised a plan, one that would get him back to northeast Kentucky. He may have been a lost cause to the state, but rest assured, if his plan worked, he wouldn't be roaming aimlessly throughout the city of Lexington. He'd head straight for home. And so he did. After 3 weeks, he made a plan to escape, and through whatever means he chose to use, it worked. He was on the other side of the gates and had successfully escaped the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum. 3 weeks earlier, he was declared insane. Now he would start to make his way home. Keep in mind, this was the 1860s, no vehicles. The only mode of traveling fathomable for such a large distance would be horse or even walking. Even today, this drive is an hour and a half, so one can only imagine how long this journey would be. He began his journey determined to get home. He found himself in Rowan County, Kentucky, some 60 miles or so from today's travel, so who knows how far it was in 1886. James Miller had made it to the Licking River. We don't know what kind of condition Miller or the river was in at this time, but he decided to cross. James Miller's would-be heroic and brave return to his home would not happen. When he attempted to cross the river, something went terribly wrong, and he didn't make it across. He drowned in the Licking River on September 15, 1886. Ironically, he died on the 21st anniversary of mustering out of the Union Army. Now we are here, just outside of Grayson, Kentucky, at the very end of Fields Branch Road, visiting the grave of James Miller. I found this story absolutely fascinating and enthralling. It's one that I had heard some time back, and as with my Pearly May Bush video that I did a few weeks ago, I have a few notes here of a few thoughts that I would like to cover at the end of the video. First of all, Colonel John Dills, which is the colonel of the regiment that James Miller served in, and I didn't know this, I visited Dills Cemetery in Pikeville, Kentucky, and I've actually visited his grave. Did not realize that he would tie into this story. And why and how did I know about this story of James Miller? He was my 3 times great-grandfather. Yes, he was one of my ancestors, and here's the thing that I like to tell people. I don't seem to have descended from royalty or heads of state. I descended from the man who escaped the insane asylum. So when my grandfather was living, I told him this story when I found all the information. And what I had found, I'm going to put it on the screen. I had found a letter written from one of our state representatives at the time around this area, Fred Vinson, who would go on to become a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So, yeah, a future Supreme Court Justice had actually written a letter about my insane great-great-great-grandfather. But what had happened was his wife was trying to complete a pension request, and he had wrote a letter about that request. So I'm going to include that on the screen. It should be showing now. A few more things. As far as his journey, he was going in the right direction. Lexington, you would had to have come through Round County to get back to Carter County, where he was from. So, yes, he may have been considered insane by the courts, but he was on his way home in the right direction. And maybe he was about his wits because, a lot of times it was easier just to cast somebody aside according to society than to get them the help that they need. So, James Miller, there is a lot of things that I have read and I have heard. The two families business, no documentation that shows that anywhere that he had 2 families. That is just a word of mouth family story that I had found through someone else related to James Miller. So that there seems to be some credibility to it, although of course nothing like that is documented. But this is a very interesting case. I do have empathy for James Miller because I really think that with today's medicine, and maybe even back then with a little more help, he would have been okay because he did have his wits. He was not insane. That man had made it pretty close. I mean, Round County borders Carter County, so he was on his way back. Thank you all for watching. I love finding stories like this. I have future journeys planned. Please visit me. I'm going to have links in the description to my Patreon and my website. I would love to hear from you there on those 2 websites. Thank you all again for watching. And again, more stories like this coming. Please like and subscribe. Once again, from the very end of Fields Branch Road in Grayson, Kentucky, I will see you again soon.